On June 13, 2025, the state of South Carolina will carry out the execution of a man who once posed as a model citizen, an aspiring author, a charming speaker. But behind Stephen Stanko's intellect was a darkness that left two dead, a teenager brutally assaulted and a nation stunned. This is the full case breakdown, and the chilling countdown to his execution. Before we begin, if you appreciate deep investigations into true crime cases like this one, painstakingly researched and told with respect to the victims, the law, and the truth, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell icon for you not to miss our next upload. Stephen Christopher Stanko was born in 1968 in South Carolina, raised in a region marked by quiet streets, familiar faces, and the kind of modest American life where routine often masks reality. From the outside, he appeared to grow up like many boys of his generation, clean-cut, attentive, often described as bright and polite. But even in his early years, those closest to him noticed something difficult to explain, a kind of emotional detachment that never quite fit the setting. Teachers praised his intellect but rarely his empathy. He was gifted with language, adept at making others listen, yet slow to form bonds that lasted. By the time he reached adulthood, his intelligence had become his most powerful tool, allowing him to move in and out of jobs and relationships with ease, leaving little trace of who he really was. And while others his age were navigating college or starting families, Stanko was already testing the limits of control. By 1996, his name was in the system, not as a social advocate or rising mind, but as a convicted felon serving a 10-year sentence for assault and kidnapping. That transformation, subtle, deliberate, and masked by charm, had been years in the making, and when he crossed into the prison system, he didn't resist the label of inmate. Instead, he studied it. He learned the routines. He observed. He wrote. From his cell, he authored a book titled Living in Prison, a history of the correctional system with an insider's view, a work that read less like a memoir and more like a research project, as if he were documenting a world he intended to understand and one day manipulate. To those on the outside, his intellect suggested redemption. To those inside, it served as a warning few recognized in time. And when he was released early in 2004, after nearly a decade behind bars, he didn't emerge looking lost or broken. He looked prepared. He relocated to Georgetown, South Carolina, a town not far from where he had grown up, where new neighbors didn't ask many questions, and where a man with polished speech and a clean record, at least on paper, could begin again. What they didn't know was how carefully he had rehearsed the role. April 7, 2005 began as a typical spring Thursday in Georgetown County, South Carolina, a quiet corner of the state where routines rarely broke and where small-town life carried a sense of familiarity and comfort. For Laura Ling, a 43-year-old librarian known for her professionalism, kindness, and love for books, it was meant to be an ordinary day, the kind that ended with dinner at home and her teenage daughter upstairs. But what unfolded in that house was anything but ordinary. It was unspeakable, planned, and carried out with a degree of violence that left even seasoned investigators reeling. Stephen Stanko, recently released from prison and presenting himself as a changed man, intellectual, articulate, reformed, was staying as a guest in Laura Ling's home, having convinced her and others in the community that he was simply a man rebuilding his life. She had extended him the kind of generosity that people in small towns often do for someone they believe deserves a second chance. But behind the civility he projected was a cold intent that had already been set in motion. Sometime during the night, without warning or provocation that authorities could trace, Stanko attacked Laura Ling inside her own home. Evidence showed that she was beaten with a blunt object and strangled. The attack was sustained and personal, indicating rage, but also control. Police would later confirm the room where she died showed signs of struggle, with blood spatter and damage indicating a prolonged assault. But what shocked investigators even more was what they found next. Ling's 15-year-old daughter, who had been home that night, was discovered critically wounded. She had been raped and had her throat slashed, left in her bedroom to die. It was a miracle she survived. Despite her injuries, the teenager managed to crawl to a phone and dial 911. Her voice, barely audible through the slashing wound, alerted dispatchers and officers were dispatched immediately. When they arrived, they found Laura Ling already dead. Her daughter, covered in blood but still breathing, was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The horror of the scene was difficult to comprehend. A quiet home turned crime scene, a mother brutally murdered, a daughter clinging to life, and the man who had been their guest, who had shared their table and spoken of literature and redemption, now missing. By the time police began their investigation, Stephen Stanko had already fled. His name was quickly linked to the scene through witness accounts, the daughter's initial statement and evidence found in the house. A manhunt was launched immediately across Georgetown County, but Stanko had a head start and he used it well. Just one day later, on April 8, 2005, over 50 miles north in Horry County, police responded to another call, this time at the home of 74-year-old Henry Lee Turner in the town of Conway. Turner was a well-known retired local who had extended a temporary place to stay to Stephen Stanko. It's believed Turner, like Laura Ling, was unaware of Stanko's criminal history or his status as a fugitive. By all accounts, Turner was simply being kind to a man he believed was in need of help. But kindness again was met with violence. The crime scene at Turner's home was starkly different, less messy, less chaotic, but no less horrifying. Turner had been shot twice in the neck at close range. There were no signs of struggle. Authorities believed the killing was swift, calculated, and clinical. After the murder, Stanko took Turner's 1996 green Pontiac Grand Prix and left the scene. He also stole Turner's checkbook and bank cards, later making unauthorized withdrawals from ATMs across state lines. Now linked to 2 violent murders and an attempted murder in 2 separate counties within less than 36 hours, Stanko was officially named a suspect, and a state and nationwide manhunt began. The FBI joined the case. Law enforcement across South Carolina, Georgia, and the Carolinas were put on alert. Surveillance footage from ATMs began to show Stanko's face, calm, composed, clean-shaven, casually withdrawing money using Henry Turner's information. As news spread, residents of both Georgetown and Horry counties locked their doors. Local schools increased security. People were stunned, not just by the brutality of the crimes, but by how easily Stanko had embedded himself into their communities, how easily he had worn the mask of civility, and how quickly it had dropped. He wasn't hiding in shadows. He was, as he had always been, a man who understood how to look normal, until the moment he chose not to. In the days following, forensic teams continued to work the crime scenes. In Laura Ling's house, DNA and blood evidence confirmed Stanko's presence. In Turner's home, shell casings and fingerprints tied him again to the murder. Investigators began reconstructing the timeline, mapping his movements and issuing public warnings. The daughter who survived would eventually offer damning testimony, providing direct insight into not only what happened that night, but how methodical Stanko had been. According to her, there was no wild rage, no warning scream. It all happened with terrifying control. The clock was now ticking, and authorities knew they were racing against a man who had already proven he could kill without hesitation, and plan his next move just as quickly. As the horrifying details of 2 murders and a near-fatal assault in South Carolina made their way into law enforcement bulletins, television screens, and front pages across the country, the man responsible, Stephen Stanko, was already slipping through state lines. Described by authorities as armed and highly dangerous, he had gone from houseguest to fugitive in less than 48 hours. With the stolen vehicle of one of his victims, Henry Lee Turner, and access to stolen financial accounts, Stanko stayed mobile, withdrawing cash in increments from ATMs, moving across state borders undetected, and changing his appearance just enough to avoid instant recognition. He cut his hair, possibly dyed it, and altered his clothing to appear more like a traveling businessman than a man wanted for double homicide. The media quickly picked up the story. Headlines labeled him the educated killer and the gentleman fugitive, pointing to the unsettling contrast between his polished demeanor and the savagery of the crimes. His background as a published author and former inmate turned supposed scholar only added layers to the growing national intrigue. But behind the media buzz was a coordinated, relentless manhunt. The FBI, U.S. Marshals, and multiple state law enforcement agencies were all working together to close the net on Stanko before he struck again. Forensic evidence from both crime scenes had definitively identified him. Surveillance images showed him at ATMs in different cities, including Florence, Columbia, and eventually Augusta, Georgia. Authorities feared that with every hour on the run, he was growing bolder and more desperate. Witnesses along the way described him as calm, polite, and controlled. One gas station clerk in Georgia told police he had served Stanko and remembered his manners, saying please and thank you as he paid in cash. That same day, another witness reported seeing him at a hotel, where he had checked in under an alias. He had left no physical trace behind, no discarded items, no cell phone activity, no electronic trail beyond the ATM withdrawals. For seasoned manhunters, this case was unlike the usual fugitive profile. This wasn't someone running in panic. Stanko was methodical, tactical, and frighteningly composed. But on April 12, 2005, 5 days after the first killing, Stephen Stanko's run came to an end. Acting on a tip from a resident who recognized his photo from a news broadcast, U.S. Marshals located him inside a Barnes & Noble bookstore in Augusta, Georgia. He had returned to the one place he thought he might blend in, a bookstore surrounded by literature, sitting quietly as though none of it had happened. When marshals closed in, Stanko did not resist. He was arrested without incident, still carrying items linked to his victims and in possession of a firearm. His calm demeanor remained intact even during his arrest. He was clean-shaven, dressed in khakis and a collared shirt, and spoke with clarity when officers read him his rights. The arrest was recorded and broadcast across national news. Law enforcement held press conferences in both Georgetown and Horry counties. "The threat is over," said one sheriff. But for prosecutors, investigators, and the surviving victims, the real work was just beginning. The calm face of Stephen Stanko had masked horrors that were now making their way into court dockets, witness statements, and forensic reports. The manhunt had ended, but the shadow he left over South Carolina would linger far longer. After his capture, Stephen Stanko was returned to South Carolina, where prosecutors in two separate counties, Georgetown and Horry, prepared for what would become two of the most chilling and emotionally grueling capital murder trials the state had ever seen. The legal proceedings would span years, requiring judges, juries, and families to relive the horrors not once but twice. In both trials, prosecutors had one clear goal: a sentence of death. And in both cases they would succeed. The first trial took place in Georgetown County in 2006, and it focused on the brutal murder of Laura Ling and the horrific assault on her teenage daughter. The girl, who had survived the attack by playing dead, took the stand and delivered testimony that transfixed the courtroom in silence and brought many to tears. She described in stark, unwavering detail how Stanko, someone she had come to trust as a guest in her home, had turned violent without warning, attacking her mother and then turning on her with unrelenting cruelty. She recalled the moments when she believed she was going to die, her voice steady but weighted with pain. Prosecutors presented overwhelming forensic evidence, DNA, blood patterns, and testimony from crime scene analysts. But it was the survivor's words that left the deepest mark. Her bravery gave jurors an unflinching look into the terror she endured. The defense argued that Stephen Stanko was not in full control of his actions. They brought in neurologists and psychiatrists who testified about abnormalities in his brain, lesions, irregularities in the frontal lobe, and past signs of trauma that, they claimed, could impair impulse control and emotional regulation. But the prosecution countered with a damning narrative. This was not the work of a man in the grip of madness, but of a man who meticulously planned his crimes, who manipulated people with charm and intellect, and who felt no remorse for what he had done. They pointed out that he had researched poisons, sought out weapons, and cleaned up after his crimes in ways that only someone fully aware of guilt would do. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty. And shortly after, they sentenced Stephen Stanko to death for the murder of Laura Ling and the attempted murder and sexual assault of her daughter. The judge pronounced the sentence in a courtroom heavy with emotion, while members of Ling's family held one another, knowing that the first battle for justice had been won, but that the second was still to come. In 2009, 3 years later, Stanko stood trial again, this time in Horry County for the murder of 74-year-old Henry Lee Turner, a generous man who had offered Stanko a place to stay. Prosecutors laid out the cold sequence of events. Stanko shot Turner in the neck not once, but twice, then robbed him and used his vehicle and bank account to fund his escape. They described it as an execution, pure and calculated, carried out by a man who had no intention of being caught and no regret over what he had done. The jury heard about Turner's quiet life, his kindness, his trusting nature, and how those traits made him an easy target for a man like Stanko. Again, the defense returned to the argument of mental illness, presenting brain scans and expert testimony in an attempt to show that Stanko's actions were not entirely his own. But jurors remained unconvinced. The prosecution emphasized the timeline, the strategy, and the clinical way Stanko moved from one crime scene to the next. They underscored that this was not a man haunted by delusions but a predator with the intelligence and self-control to write books, mislead authorities, and even charm his victims in the hours before their deaths. At the end of the second trial, Stanko was once again sentenced to death, this time for the murder of Henry Lee Turner. It was a rare and resounding legal outcome, 2 separate death sentences handed down in 2 counties, both upheld on appeal. Legal analysts at the time noted how unusual it was for a single defendant to receive multiple death sentences from separate juries in different jurisdictions. But for the families of Laura Ling and Henry Lee Turner, it was less about the rarity and more about resolution. Justice, in their eyes, had finally caught up to a man who once believed he was too clever to ever be held accountable. As courtroom sketches faded into archival footage and photos of the victims filled news reports, South Carolina's message to Stephen Stanko became unmistakable. There would be no more hiding behind intellect, no more second chances, and no more freedom. The state had spoken. Twice. In May of 2025, after nearly 2 decades of legal battles, delays, and courtroom challenges, the South Carolina Supreme Court issued an official death warrant for inmate Stephen Ross Stanko, now 57 years old, setting in motion the final steps toward carrying out a sentence that had been legally affirmed twice, and morally demanded, in the eyes of the families whose lives he had forever shattered. It was an announcement that came with sobering weight, not just for the Department of Corrections, but for a state reactivating its capital punishment machinery after a prolonged hiatus, and for a public once again confronted with the question of justice in its most irreversible form. In accordance with South Carolina law, Stanko was given a grim choice: execution by lethal injection, the electric chair, or the newly authorized firing squad, 3 methods, each shrouded in legal controversy and moral scrutiny. Yet despite the gravity of the decision, Stanko selected lethal injection. The method traditionally used before the state's supply of execution drugs had dwindled and the law had to be rewritten to allow alternative means of carrying out capital sentences. In response, his legal team filed an urgent lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of all available execution methods, arguing that each posed a risk of unconstitutional suffering under the 8th Amendment, citing recent expert opinions on botched injections, electrical malfunctions, and the inherent brutality of a firing squad. The court reviewed the filing, weighed it against years of upheld appeals, and ruled that the execution would proceed as scheduled, with the state assuring the public that all protocols had been secured, that the facility was prepared, and that trained personnel would carry out the sentence under strict procedural oversight. As of June 1, 2025, Stephen Stanko entered the final phase of death row, moved into a special cell within Broad River Correctional Institution where he would remain under 24-hour observation, allowed only limited visits from his attorney and spiritual advisor, with his meals, movements, and correspondence carefully logged and monitored in a protocol designed as much for security as for the solemnity of the process. And with each passing day, the walls around him grew quieter, the lights dimmer, the routine more mechanical, as if the institution itself was preparing for the cold inevitability of what would occur on June 13 at precisely 6 p.m. With clemency formally denied by Governor Henry McMaster and all appeals exhausted through the federal courts, the final countdown began in earnest, not with loud announcements or dramatic press releases, but in quiet legal notifications, closed-door briefings, and the daily rituals of a correctional system readying itself to execute a man who had once fooled the world with his intellect, manipulated strangers with charm, and taken lives without remorse, and now, faced with the finality of state-sanctioned death, had no more arguments to make, no more courts to persuade, and no more time to delay the inevitable. In the days leading up to the execution, as media outlets posted countdown clocks and news vans circled the perimeter of Broad River Correctional, the public was reminded not just of the crimes, but of the man behind them, a once celebrated author and prison intellectual who had claimed insight into the American penal system but ultimately became its most damning case study, sentenced to death not once but twice, and soon to be among the first inmates executed under South Carolina's revised capital punishment statutes, a name soon to leave the headlines, to fade from breaking news alerts, and to enter the annals of history as a case that tested the legal system, haunted 2 counties, and reignited a conversation about how justice is defined when the ultimate penalty is at stake. Stephen Stanko will die by lethal injection, scheduled to take place behind the sealed doors of South Carolina's Broad River Correctional Institution on June 13, 2025, witnessed by prison officials, a select few reporters, and the families whose lives he forever fractured. But long after the chemicals stop flowing, after the heartbeat monitor goes flat, and after the media turns its attention to the next headline, the irreversible damage he inflicted will remain, etched into the lives of his surviving victims, burned into the memory of grieving relatives, and archived in the evidence boxes of 2 counties that still remember the day their ordinary streets were invaded by a man whose mind was sharp, whose manners were composed, and whose actions revealed the chilling reality that the most dangerous predators often do not growl but smile. If you found this case as unsettling and important as we did, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more in-depth breakdowns of real crimes, real consequences, and the often overlooked details that echo long after the courtroom closes. Leave a comment below to share your thoughts on the justice system, and whether executions like Stanko's bring true closure or simply mark the end of a tragic chapter. Don't forget to like the video and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters.